Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeremy Mathis. I'm a professor of Arctic security in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And I'm delighted to join you today to talk about an issue that is becoming more and more pressing, and that's China's interest in the Arctic. And I'm delighted to do this because I'm joined by a panel of experts who are going to talk about their unique perspective on what's going on with China in the Arctic, because China's interest in the Arctic has surged in recent years, capturing the attention of global policymakers and environmentalists alike. The formerly icy expanse of the Arctic, once perceived as a remote and inaccessible frontier, has become a focal point for China's strategic ambitions and economic pursuits. As the world watches, Beijing's increasing involvement in the Arctic raises important questions about its intentions, impact, and the broader implications for international cooperation as well as geopolitical competition. The Arctic, as a vast, environmentally delicate region, is undergoing profound transformations due to climate change. Melting ice caps have opened up new shipping routes and access to valuable natural resources, including oil, natural gas, minerals, and fisheries. These developments have piqued China's interest as the country seeks to secure its own energy supply, expand its economic footprint, and assert itself as a major player on the global stage. China's Arctic strategy is multifaceted, encompassing investments in infrastructure, research, and diplomacy. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, China's ambitious global infrastructure development plan, extends into the Arctic region, aiming to connect China to Europe via the Northern Sea Route. This initiative has sparked concern about environmental sustainability and potential geopolitical tension, as China's economic activities in the Arctic could disrupt the fragile ecosystems and threaten territorial claims of Arctic nations. Furthermore, China has established permanent research interests like the Yellow River Station in Svalbard to conduct scientific studies in the Arctic. These efforts not only contribute to our increased understanding of climate change, but also strengthens China's position as a stakeholder in the region. Diplomatically, China has engaged with the Arctic Council, a key intergovernmental forum for Arctic affairs, as an observer state, and its influence within that organization continues to grow. China's burgeoning interest in the Arctic is both an opportunity and a challenge. It presents possibilities for enhanced international cooperation on climate change mitigation and scientific research, but also raises concerns about environmental impacts, geopolitical tensions, and the sustainable development of this fragile region. As the Arctic continues to undergo rapid change, the world watches closely to see how China's involvement will shape the future of this pristine wilderness and its global significance. I'm joined today by three China experts to share their perspective. Trym Arthurier from the Arctic Institute, Mark Lanteigne of Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø, and Shuxian Luo of the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and a non-resident fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. So we'll start first with Shuxian to address what are the key drivers behind China's growing interest in the Arctic, and how have these motivations changed over time?
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for having me. I feel you just gave a very comprehensive overview of the questions I'm about to address. So China, as you said, China has a number of key interests, which all of which are outlined, and most of which are outlined in its 2018 Arctic White Paper. So the first driver is hydrocarbon resources, natural resource extractions. As we know, that China has a strong interest in exploring and developing the oil and natural gas resources in the Arctic. In particular, the Russian Arctic accounts for the great majority of Chinese investments in the region so far, and some of the most prominent projects, including the Yamal LNG project and the Arctic 2 LNG project. And beyond the Russian Arctic, China is also interested in mining and has made some investments in regions like Greenland and Canada. But of course, the scale of these investments is much smaller compared to the Chinese investments in energy projects in Russian Arctic. And the second major interest is China's interest in using the sea routes, as you mentioned, northern sea routes that are opened up as a result of Arctic warming. And China's investments, in Russian Arctic, or its interest in potential investments in the Russian Arctic, also have a focus on, port and railway infrastructure facilities in the region. And I think the third area of China's interest is Arctic scientific research. China has a longstanding research interest in this region as an environmental zone to understand, potential adverse impact that global climate change and Arctic warming would have for China, like, causing extreme weather, as we have seen in recent years in China, and also, of course, in the United States as well, and environmental degradation in China and its impacts on agriculture and food production domestically. And as you also mentioned, China has established two permanent research stations in Arctic, one in Norway and the other in Iceland. And I think the fourth driver of China's interest is that China seeks to expand its participation and have a bigger say in Arctic Council, although at the same time, China recognizes in its white paper the sovereignty and sovereign rights that Arctic states are entitled to under UNCLOS. And last but not least, I think, as mentioned in the introduction of the event, China sees its growing Arctic presence as a demonstration of its global reach, also, a showcase of its cutting-edge technologies, prestige, and also a validation of its status as a global power rather than just a regional power. And I think, these interests have evolved, actually expanded considerably over time, because China's initial and the oldest interest in the Arctic was more focused on scientific research and using scientific cooperation more as a way of diplomacy. But in the past decade, China's Arctic interest has quickly expanded, due to a variety of factors, such as China's goal of, increasing energy, clean energy in its total energy consumption, Western sanctions using, exploit the opportunity that opened up by, Western sanctions on Russia since 2014, and also, accelerated global change, etc. But it should also be noted that, many of the new opportunities as envisioned in Chinese experts' writings, such as the Arctic shipping lane, really reflect a long-term thinking rather than, a reflection of China seeing such an immediate interest in the region. So I think so far, or at least in the short run, the Arctic is not truly a top priority in Chinese foreign policy. I just stop here and look forward to further discussion.
Thank you very much, Shuxian, for those great comments. We'll turn now to Mark to provide an overview of China's current and planned infrastructure and investment projects in the Arctic, such as the Belt and Road Initiative along the Arctic shipping corridors that are opening. And Mark, can you tell us what implication do these projects have for the region's geopolitics, especially given China's growing relationship with Russia?
Hey, thank you very much. Thank you for having me this evening. Hi from Tromsø. So looking at China's economic progress in the Arctic has been very fascinating. There were quite a few very ambitious plans about a decade ago that the Belt and Road would be in a position to expand into the Arctic, not only in partnership with Russia, but there were many plans that Beijing had that would essentially encompass the entire Arctic. There was even some discussion in early dialogues about maybe changing the Belt and Road to one belt, one road, and one circle, which really demonstrated high hopes for the Arctic. The reality hasn't really kind of matched the rhetoric, I would say, mainly because there have been quite a few logistical roadblocks, not only in regards to budget, but also in terms of politics that has prevented China from getting much of what it wants in the region. So you go back to about 10 years ago, and there was a discussion about whether the Belt and Road would eventually work its way into the Arctic. As was noted, China is still a relative newcomer with a lot of its economic plans in the far north. Nevertheless, there was quite a bit of initial discussion that at some point in the future, I was told maybe 20 years into the future, 25, the Belt and Road would eventually work its way into the Arctic region. Lo and behold, we get a very obscure paper from the State Oceanic Administration and various economic directives referring to the Arctic as a blue economic corridor, which would be eventually connected to the Belt and Road itself. And that was the first kind of official sign that the Belt and Road was about to expand into the Arctic. Then, as was noted, you have China releasing its first Arctic white paper in 2018, which confirmed that the Belt and Road would be extending into the region. But what exactly are we talking about when we talk about the Polar Silk Road? Well, not surprisingly, Russia was scheduled to form the bulk of what these polar plans were. There had already been quite a few ambitious plans to develop pipelines for oil and gas that would connect Siberia with China. There was a lot of discussion initially about making use of the Northern Sea route for Chinese shipping into Northern Europe. However, what came afterwards began to be a little bit more ambitious in scope. We started to talk quite a bit, including in the white paper, about expanding Chinese shipping into the Northwest Passage in Northern Canada, and perhaps even 20 odd years into the future, the Central Arctic. So certainly Beijing was not lacking for ambition. As was also noted, much of what China was seeking economically in the Arctic also had to do with extractive industries. There were very lofty plans to expand mining in Greenland, to potentially engage in further oil and gas investment in Russia. There was even talk about natural gas cooperation in Alaska and a gold mine in Canada. Not too many of these plans actually came to fruition. And like I said, some of these were logistical and some of these were actually political. China had quite a bit of infrastructure plans as well. There was a lot of talk, as was noted, about an Arctic railway, including up here in northern Norway. Tromsø doesn't have a train station. So if we want to head south, we either take a car or a bus or a plane. There was some discussion about 5 years ago about developing, with Chinese backing, a train station here, along with an expanded port in Kirkenes. Quite a few Russian railway plans also were drawn out, not all of which have actually come to fruition. And there was even talk about a tunnel connecting Tallinn and Helsinki. So again, very many ambitious projects. The problem now, though, is, first of all, much of China's Polar Silk Road ambitions have begun to slow down. Now, some of this can certainly be attributed to COVID and China's zero COVID policy between 2020 and 2013. The other major factor, though, is what has been happening ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. China has officially declared neutrality, and it has been very, very careful to walk the line by giving support to Russia, at least in terms of China-Russia Arctic cooperation, but not going over that line to instigate Western US-led sanctions. So China is buying Siberian oil. It is developing Siberian gas. There's been a marked slowdown, though, in Chinese shipping into the Northern Sea route, although there's this new shipping company, appropriately called New Shipping, which is starting to make test runs. And we are also seeing China be a little bit more nervous about being seen as helping Russia too much, even though there's been a lot of cocktail party chatter about how the two countries will continue a partnership. So the Polar Silk Road right now is very much in question. We are not totally sure, especially given the uncertain situation with the Chinese economy, just how much that particular part of the Belt and Road will develop. But China still made it clear that it does see the Arctic as an area of economic interest, financial interest. So time will tell. Thanks.
Thanks for those great comments, Mark. I have one follow-up question for you, given the complication that China's interest in the Arctic hit when Russia invaded Ukraine and the world's attention sort of shifted to that. Do you think that the conflict between Israel and Gaza now is going to shift focus away from that and allow China to start deepening its relationship with Russia in the Arctic again?
That is a possibility, although again, I think China is very concerned about extending its economic reach into the Arctic too quickly. Right now, China is facing a lot of domestic level economic challenges. And I think it is, even though it is observed the 10th anniversary of the BRI and is not officially called for any scaling back of its Arctic investment, I think that under current circumstances, China is going to take a little bit more of a watch and wait mode.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. So I want to turn now to Trym and ask him to unpack how China's pursuit of scientific research and environmental cooperation in the Arctic aligns with its economic and strategic interest in the region. And are there any potential areas of conflict or cooperation with other Arctic nations where this may lead?
Right. I mean, the first question with this prompt that I kind of thought about was, we don't really have a clear picture of what China's strategic interests in the Arctic are. As Zhu Qian noted in her commentary, she laid out the 2018 Arctic policy paper, where a lot of these interests are sketched out in terms of environmental protection, governance, natural resource management, and scientific research as kind of acting kind of as a vanguard for all of these different policy areas. And China's sort of scientific program in the Arctic, or scientific activities in the Arctic, has, I think in recent years, become kind of a Rorschach test in terms of how they're viewed by states in the Arctic. Some will view it as completely innocuous, take it at face value, being focused primarily on climate change research, and also to some extent kind of preparing the way for what Mark talked about, the Polar Silk Road, notably shipping and resource governance. And then you have the more, let's say, critical view of China's scientific presence in the region being a precursor to some type of military presence, for example, and that China has, well, geostrategic interests in the region that it's interested in acting upon. You had Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State of the United States, in 2019 during the Arctic Council ministerial meeting, kind of warning that China's civilian research program was sort of paving the way for a future. I think he mentioned specifically like a nuclear submarine presence in the Arctic. And he was citing a Department of Defense report about China's People's Liberation Army, which that same year, 2019, had for the first time included a section on China's presence in the Arctic region. You've had the intelligence agencies and Department of Defense or defense ministries in other Arctic countries have similar reports or threat assessments where they warned against the potential dual use of China's scientific presence in the Arctic, both in terms of the research that they're doing, but also the infrastructure. So you mentioned the research station in Svalbard. You have the more recent China Icelandic Arctic Observatory in Northern Iceland. Up until recently, they had an agreement with Esrange, this Swedish satellite kind of space research facility in northern Sweden. And there's been a few other instances of at least an interest in establishing more of a kind of hard scientific footprint, to put it that way, in the Arctic. And I think also since then, a lot of the headlines have been about this dual use potential or dual use. Well, I wouldn't say potential in these headlines, because they all seem to conclude that there is a dual use interest in China's Arctic research, and that this again is helping support a future military presence, for example, or helping China gain some form of situational awareness in the Arctic. And I think on the latter point, that's true. That's definitely like a strategic interest, but there's really nothing that would indicate that the science that's being done is being, as of now, used for military purposes. I mean, in the sense of, there's very hard to find kind of the empirical facts to make that chain from the research that's being done either on board research vessels that they sail every year to the Arctic, at these research stations, or that is done remotely through satellite observations, buoys, and other forms of like remote sensing devices. That's not to say that this is not a risk or that that's not the case. And Arctic countries have definitely become more aware of that risk. And again, that goes to your second question in terms of areas of cooperation or conflict. And it's obvious that China's scientific presence in the region has become much more securitized in the past, let's say, 5 years. Part of that is also because of the relationship between Europe and North America, or Canada and the US, and China has become more fraught. And you see that in research collaborations outside of the Arctic as well, if it's AI, semiconductors, any kind of sort of cutting edge technology as well, that it's how you approach China in a research collaboration is coming under more scrutiny. And there are more kind of barriers that are being raised or more checks that are being done in terms of what the risks are. And part of this stems from, and again, just a few days ago at the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, Admiral Rob Bauer, who chairs the NATO's military committee, he in his speech, where he kind of gave a sort of a report on kind of the geopolitical situation in the Arctic, he emphasized transparency in the case of China, that there was a lack of transparency. And this, I feel like, it's at the core of, well, both the issue of we don't know what China's strategic interests in the region necessarily are, because obviously they're not spelled out, and they require some kind of triangulation, like from a researcher's perspective. And also because the political system and even how science is sort of done domestically is very opaque. So we're kind of lacking that information. And that makes it hard to answer to what extent, scientific research is being used to further certain economic goals or strategic or military strategic interests. I have more to add to that, but I guess I'll leave it to you now and then can come back to that later.
All right. Yeah, thank you. We'll come back to that. I wanted to touch on something that Chu Xian said during her opening remarks and see if you can talk a little bit more about the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, how that might impact China's behavior in the Arctic. And the U.S. is infamously not a signatory to UNCLOS, and what complication may that ultimately lead to when it comes to not only U.S. interest in the Arctic, but using UNCLOS to help sort of balance China's expanded interest in the Arctic?
I think, excuse me. I think China's position on how to comply its activities in the Arctic and UNCLOS is quite interesting, because we have been talking about China and UNCLOS usually in the context of the South China Sea, right? China has been persistently pointed as a bad example of the challenge in the rules-based order. But I think in the Arctic, as China stipulated in its Arctic white paper, China has been promoting the view Arctic governance should be open for greater international participation and input. China has really committed itself to adhering to the agreed international legal architecture, including UNCLOS in the Arctic. And China's conduct in the Arctic so far has seen no violation of international law, including the UNCLOS so far. And indeed, China's position, very interesting, China's position converges with that of the United States in upholding certain aspects of the UNCLOS. And a most notable example is, Russia and Canada as well invokes UNCLOS Article 234 and claims that internal waters that encompass their internal waters encompass the northern sea routes and northeastern sea lane. So for Russia, it requires the use of Russian icebreakers to escort all vessels transiting through northern sea route, and they charge toll fees and require prior notification of plans to use the route, of course. But both China and the United States hold the position that the sea routes are international waterways, and the coastal state don't have the right to restrict the transit passage right. So in other words, China and the United States are on the same page regarding the need to ensure freedom of navigation in the Arctic. That's specifically the term that China uses in its white paper. I think that's the thing. I think that's the most important thing worth being pointing out.
Thank you very much for those comments. Mark, I want to turn back to you and ask you, how has China's growing participation in Arctic governance organizations like the Arctic Council changed the dynamic of the Council itself? And what is the future of Arctic governance going to look like as China potentially takes more of an interest?
Very good questions. I would certainly say that China has really tried to portray itself as a joiner in many Arctic institutions. Not only the Arctic Council, it's been a formal observer in that organization since 2013. China's also adhered to the Polar Code. It was one of the countries that originally signed on. It's also been adhering to the Central Arctic fishing ban, which has been in place now for the last few years. So I would say that Beijing has really gone out of its way to portray itself as a partner in the region, really trying to say that we want to help develop governance in the Arctic, and that has been a priority for China's far north policy. Now, things are a little bit complicated right now. The Arctic Council went on pause right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and only has just now started to come back under semi-normal operations now that the chair has passed from Russia to Norway. There is still, however, the exclusion of Russia from the Arctic Council in political areas. And it was noted by China's Arctic representative Gao Feng in the Arctic Circle conference last year that it would be very difficult for China to continue to engage the Council with Russia not there, arguing that the group becomes something different if Russia is not present. So where China is going in regards to its Arctic Council and its Arctic governance policies, there is a little bit of ambiguity there. And I should point out that there was a proposal made a few months ago in Russia suggesting that perhaps there should be a BRICS observatory in Svalbard, in which case China might be in a position to take part. So yeah, a little bit of uncertainty in terms of where things are going, not only in terms of China's role in Arctic governance, but Arctic governance itself.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the great answer. Trim, I'll turn back to you and ask you a little bit of a U.S.-centric question of, we've heard discussions of increasing U.S. assets in the Arctic, whether it be building new icebreakers or putting capabilities in the Arctic that would improve our domain awareness. How do you think China would respond if the U.S. started making a significant increase investment in Arctic infrastructure or capabilities?
That's an interesting question, which I haven't thought of before, actually. I mean, it seems to me that the U.S. right now is making a fairly big investment in those capabilities, if it's air or ground or port infrastructure, for example. And I don't see how China, I don't see what China would respond in that case. I mean, one thing you will hear in general is that China is against any form of greater militarization of the Arctic and kind of calling for stability and, back to the way things were, when things were ostensibly more stable. So, that might be a response, and that might be something that people are thinking in who are looking at this in China right now when they see the expansion that is happening in Alaska. But again, this expansion too is, although China do kind of recur in military blueprints and or blueprint reports or in media. I mean, this is primarily directed towards Russia and sort of, or the sense of Russian militarization in the region as a response to that. So this is not predominantly happening as a response to any Chinese presence in the region or future presence. So I don't, beyond this general sense of wanting to keep the region stable and not wanting any more militarization, and that goes for Russia as well, then I don't really see what the Chinese response would be.
Thank you for that, Trim. I'll open this up to Mark and Xu Xian too before we take questions from the audience. But to ask the two of you, are there proactive steps that we can take now to prevent militarization of the Arctic or to promote cooperation over competition in the Arctic? So Xu Xian, would you like to start with that, and then we'll get Mark's thoughts?
Sure. I think, climate change is definitely a low-hanging fruit that can, where cooperation between the United States and China and other Arctic countries can definitely promote. As for militarization, I think, as Trim has mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty as to, China's future, China's possible reaction to, U.S. to any U.S. steps to step up its presence and strategic assets in the Arctic. But a recent action that China has taken with respect to Arctic security is to sign an agreement to step up its cooperation with Russian in terms of maritime law enforcement to strengthen their Coast Guard cooperation in the Arctic rather than go directly to military, to some certain form of military cooperation. I think that might be a sign that China's cautious approach towards how to approach how to cope with the security collaboration, or to avoid instigate like hyper sensitivity surrounding China's security activities in this region. So I think maritime law enforcement may be a way to to kind of curb the trend of militarization in the Arctic is another aspect where dialogue and perhaps cooperation can happen.
Great, thank you very much. Mark, over to you for your perspective on that.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's probably more of a question now what kind of militarization we're going to be seeing, because in many ways the genie is out of the bottle in regards to the fact that the Arctic is now seen by many countries, not just the Arctic states, but by China and by others, as an area of strategic concern. Just to give one quick example, we have received a series of high-level ship visits here in Tromsø. We have received an aircraft carrier. We have received nuclear engine submarines. We recently had a visit by the US icebreaker Healy. And at the same time, we have Finland, an Arctic state, now in NATO. We have Sweden slowly working its way to the organization as well. We have Russia still trying to demonstrate that it considers the Arctic to be of strategic interest. There have been all kinds of military activity in the Arctic Ocean. So the question is, what kind of military activity are we going to be seeing? Is it going to be primarily defensive, balance of power? Is it going to be, will we see a spillover, a more severe spillover of the rivalry between Russia and the West into the Arctic? As was noted, China does not want to see the Arctic to become militarized because that obviously interferes with a lot of its Belt and Road plans. But again, it may be too late to really prevent that process, at least in the short term. I would also argue, though, that even though it has been suggested, including by some American officials, that we might be seeing some kind of greater military partnership between China and Russia in the Arctic, I tend to be a bit of a skeptic with that. I still see the two countries having much different views about what the Arctic is all about. And I question whether the level of trust is there between Russia and China to really allow for close cooperation in the Arctic. Moscow has made it clear on multiple occasions, we are the Arctic state.
May I quickly add on to Mark's
absolutely. Go for it.
Sure, I completely agree with Mark's observation and his argument on how much trust there is between China and Russia, because even recent writings by Chinese experts on on the Arctic in terms of the prospect for collaboration between China and Russia in the Arctic. There's also this kind of concern and worries expressed about that there remains a lot of uncertainty with respect to how sustainable this this no limit partnership between China and Russia could ever be in the context of the Arctic, and also cautions against if there's ever the scenario that China need to cope with a situation in the Arctic between Russia and a 7 scenario, a 2 blocks scenario in the Arctic. It cautions against China to take a all-in approach to put all these eggs in one basket and start with Russia in the Arctic. So I strongly concur with Mark's observation that the distrust really issue is really running deep between the two countries.
Great, thank you for that. So we're going to open it up to our audience for their questions now. If you can use the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen and type any questions you have for our 3 great panelists this afternoon and this evening. Before or while we're waiting for you to type your questions in, I have one more question for the group about the issue of fishing in the Arctic. We know that the international moratorium went into effect in 2021 that has banned fishing in the Arctic until such time that we can see if a viable fishery exists. But we've seen evidence of China unofficially using their global fishing fleet to go out and fish around the world. Do we think that if China sees an opportunity to fish in the Arctic, that they will abide by this moratorium that they've signed on to? So I'll just go around one by one and ask you that question, and maybe Trym can start with that.
Yeah, I don't know how much I can respond to this question. I do see it as very unlikely that you will see the same pattern in the Arctic Ocean as you've seen off the coast of Latin America, for example, or anywhere else, like in the high seas. I mean, and that kind of goes back to the previous question that Mark and Shu-Jian replied to as well, just in the sense of what this would mean diplomatically for China in the Arctic Ocean, and also sort of around the Arctic Ocean, coast guards and their capabilities to to police things like this. It seems unlikely. I mean, there is, again, kind of going back to what I was talking about in the beginning and looking at the technological end of things. I mean, you do see papers, research discussing sort of polar fishing vessels. I mean, and also talking about the Arctic Ocean. But this is very conceptual stuff, and this is that doesn't equate any kind of interest in exploiting Arctic fisheries in the future. I mean, past this moratorium. And in terms of the more sort of geopolitical effects of China's fishing fleet, again, I think it's difficult and people should be cautious about sort of extrapolating from China's behavior elsewhere to the Arctic Ocean. I mean, it's a sound thing to keep in the back of one's mind, but I think it's important to kind of look at the regional dynamics as well. Why this behavior might seem less plausible in that case. Yeah, but I'll leave it to the others to respond as well.
All right. Thank you, Trym. Mark, how about you on that one?
Yes, it's a very good question. So China has agreed to abide by the Central Arctic Fishing Moratorium. And I don't see any sign that China is willing to back away from that in the short term. Now, on the other hand, looking at the example of the Southern Ocean, China, along with Russia, have been very reluctant to support fishing bans in certain areas in and around Antarctica. It's been much less enthusiastic as other parts of the world in putting those bans into force. Now, that would seem to suggest that, yes, China does wish to maintain access to key fishing grounds. And the Arctic is going to be, especially as the Central Arctic becomes more ice-free over the next 20, 30 years, a very tempting location for expanded fishing. So it will be interesting to see whether China may feel that its need to be seen as a partner, to be seen as a responsible stakeholder in the Arctic might be overridden. I would say in the short term, though, I agree, it's very unlikely because China knows that it's under a microscope in the Arctic, that many countries, including the United States, are waiting for any kind of revisionist behavior. And from a cost benefit, I don't see China doing it in the short term. But one thing I learned when studying Chinese foreign policy, never say never.
Thank you, Mark. Shuxian?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd like to also build on Mark's and Trym's remarks, because when talking about China's distant fishing fleet, we look at China's behavior in off the coast of Africa and Latin America, and look at how much IUU fishing activities China's fishing fleet have been involved. But scholars like Tabitha Mallory have looked at China's subsidy system and how China tried to curb its fishing fleet's behavior in Farsi or in other countries, EEZ. There have been, documents and policies adopted, on the part of, the central government, at least on paper, try to tackle with some of the issues that have been raised with respect to China's distant fishing fleet. So if we try to, use some of the example or some of past president China's behavior, in these regions as a kind of a projection into, how China might likely to behave in the Arctic, I agree with Mark that China would be very cautious, at least, with respect to its stated policy as to, to make sure that its fishing activities in the Arctic area would show a compliance with, the rules in international agreement, including the fishing moratorium in the longest in the far future. And in the near future, of course, China has stated its interest in expanding fishing activities and also tourism in Arctic, but still is signed on to the fishing ban in Central Arctic. So I think that's a sign that China, in order to show that it's a good actor a good player in Arctic, that it's willing to in the short term to at least to show some of its interest, economic interest in the region, to show its good faith in being a responsible stakeholder in that region.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And we have some questions from our audience. And Mark, I'm going to turn this one to you because you mentioned Antarctica specifically in your last response. How would you compare the activities, military, scientific, or otherwise, in the Arctic to the Antarctic? And I know that's an important distinction that people who don't study this field are always curious about, is what's the difference between the North Pole and the South Pole?
Hey, thank you. Excellent question. And before returning to Norway, I was based in that unknown Arctic country known as New Zealand. So I had a chance to kind of look at these issues from a very kind of southern polar viewpoint. Yeah, the big difference between, besides the obvious land versus water dynamics between the Arctic and the Antarctic, is that there is a very robust, since the 1950s, treaty system in place governing conduct in Antarctica, which China has been very reluctant, and many other countries have been very reluctant to challenge. Now, the Chinese government has said that if certain aspects of the treaty change, China's policies will change with. And one particular area which gets a lot of attention is the Madrid Protocol, which is very particular in terms of what economic activities can take place there. So these are obviously very restricted. So you have a more robust treaty system governing Antarctica. And the other big point is that unlike Antarctica, which has no permanent population, there is, depending on count, about 4 million people living in the Arctic. So China is finding itself a little bit more restricted in terms of what it can do in regards to both of its military and its economic activity. That said, though, China is also noting that it wants to engage in scientific cooperation with Arctic states. It wants to, again, understand how the Arctic is affecting China directly. And we have similar dynamics going on in Antarctica. China is very interested in climate change, and this is definitely one point where it shares with the United States.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Mark. And that's a great lead into our next question that I'll pose to Trym, is to what extent can the study of what is happening in the Arctic inform us about global climate change? And are China and Russia involved in any cooperation in this regard?
So to do the second question first, I mean, so the two countries have had scientific collaboration sort of is increased in lockstep with the bilateral relationship, I think, in the Arctic. Now you do have research stations, not research stations, but research centers and institutes and sort of these bilateral ones that have been set up. There is a polar marine science one in Qingdao, for example, in China. And Mark mentioned this idea of a BRICS station in Barentsburg in Svalbard, this Russian settlement, which would include China. And I know there's been Chinese interest in that station, at least not on an official level, but by Chinese academics. There's also been I think earlier this year, I think in May, there was also a research center set up at Harbin Engineering University in northern China, which is a polar acoustics laboratory, which again, going back to sort of the whole dual use aspect, which was built out of this, well, I wouldn't call it long-standing, but a few years of like annual conferences between Russian and Chinese researchers on polar acoustics, mainly the Arctic Ocean. So that's another form of collaboration. They also share a polar technology, a polar engineering laboratory. It's based at the same university, where you do have projects on, well, the one concrete that I know of is of these air cushion vehicles for polar region, for use in the polar region. So by air cushion, we can think of hovercrafts that are, at least in the literature, sort of described as to help scientific research. And that's a collaborative project. But yeah, in terms of the first question, I'm not sure exactly if this is meant to, if you could repeat it and then I might have another question just to qualify it.
Sure. It's just that what can the Arctic inform us, or how can the Arctic inform us when it comes to global climate change, and perhaps touch on the fact that the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the planet because of Arctic amplification, and the changes that we see in the Arctic are a precursor for the large change that we could expect on a planetary scale later on. Right.
I mean, that would be my response, to be honest. I mean, not being a climate researcher, being, a layperson in that regard, just bringing it back to China, I mean, that's the scientific interest, to study the teleconnections and the sort of remote effects of Arctic warming at lower latitudes, I mean, especially its own territory, which is leading to sort of a greater frequency of extreme weather events. And on the other side, there's also an interest in understanding how emissions and economic activity at lower latitudes is affecting the Arctic. But obviously the former is more important. And I am speaking of China again. So that, I think that would be my sort of restricted response to that question. Yeah.
Thank you. Mark and Shuxian, any comments from your perspective, Mark?
Sure, yes. I'm reminded there's been a great deal of discussion, not only within China, but internationally, about when China began to use the term near-Arctic state as part of its policy speeches and eventually government documents. Now, that was not taken well in some quarters because it applied a certain degree of revisionism, that China was trying to claim Arctic status that it didn't have. It's interesting to note, though, that the term actually has its origins in Chinese academia. And it reflected at the time not only China's worries that it was going to be shut out of the region, especially with all the talk about 10 odd years ago about a resource boom, but it also really reflected that China was beginning to wonder how the Arctic climate change in the Arctic was affecting China itself. Everything from really bad winters in Shanghai, freak rainstorms in Beijing, changed pollution and wind patterns caused by snowfall in Siberia. It really kind of galvanized a lot of China's scientific thinking about, okay, how is the Arctic affecting us? And for a very long time, and it's still more or less the case, much of China's polar scientific inquiry was directed towards Antarctica. Now, this has slowly begun to shift, but it also really illustrated that China had a lot of catch up to do in regards to any kind of scientific inquiry about how climate change was affecting China.
Thank you, Mark. Shuxian?
I think I just quickly add on to what Trym and Mark just said. I think especially, since the war in Ukraine started, China has expressed this concern about, the war and also the exclusion of Russia from Arctic governance institutions can really impact, multilateral collaborations to tackle global warming, especially in the Arctic. So I think that's a major concern that had been really reflected in the Chinese experts' writings, coming recently out of the Chinese academia and policy community.
Great, thank you very much. And that sort of transitions us into our next question, and I'll pose this to all three of you one at a time, is can you touch on China's capabilities to operate in the Arctic theater in contrast to Arctic states? And I'll put the caveat in there that China is about to have 2 icebreakers and the US is about to have 1 icebreaker. And so how is the non-Arctic states like China catching up in terms of capabilities compared to the Arctic states? So Mark, I'll start with you for that one.
Sure, thanks. Well, if we're talking about icebreaker potential, yes, China has 2 operational icebreakers. A third is being readied for deployment either later this year or early next. And certainly China sees these icebreakers as very important to its scientific missions. And as was previously noted, this does raise a few questions about dual use capabilities, especially in regards to where navigation data is going to be going. In regards to military capability, the ability of, let's say, the PLA to operate in the Arctic, I think China is much more restrained. Yes, they have sent vessels into the Arctic, off the coast of Alaska, in the Baltic region, but each time it was usually in tandem with Russian forces, and it was usually a show the flag type operation. So far, China has been very, very reluctant to unilaterally send any serious military material into the Arctic, again, knowing that it would be there would be a very bad reaction from the United States, but also Russia is very touchy about its own Arctic sovereignty and certainly would not take too well to China engaging in any kind of unilateral military action. So I would say to look at the question in comparison with the Arctic states, I think China is still very much restrained. And even if it wasn't, we have to get back to the problem of cost benefit. What would China gain by this kind of military unilateralism in the Arctic? Even though there's been all kinds of speculation, we might see Chinese submarines operating off the coast of Norway, or they might begin to challenge American vessels there. What would the gain be? And that, I think, still needs to be decided.
Thanks, Mark. Trym, anything from your perspective on that question?
Yeah. First, I'd echo what Mark said in terms of the cost-benefit analysis. That seems to be a good indicator in terms of the plausibility of China even having that interest in the short term, at least. I think what is interesting, just going back to icebreakers, because that's always where we end up. Was always what we end up talking about. yes, it has 2 icebreakers. It has acquired a third one, as Mark mentioned. There was fairly recently, at least earlier this year, announced that it was building a 4th one. Again, earmarked for research purposes. In 2018, you had this project that was announced about developing nuclear-powered icebreakers, which is a project that we haven't really heard from since then, but there is activity around it. But again, there's no sort of concrete sense of if it will ever materialize or what the timeline will be. In 2021, you also had, I believe it was with the Ministry of Transportation, or it was the Ministry of Industry and Information, I can't remember which right now, that greenlit a project to develop a so-called heavy icebreaker. So, but a conventionally powered one, which was, at least in the statements, will be earmarked, supporting the Polar Silk Road. So again, shipping. So it could be a dedicated icebreaker for escorts, provide search and rescue service, search and rescue services. So it's interesting to look at what is happening domestically. You might not see any kind of sort of activities now, or see any kind of indication by Chinese officials about what their interests might be, or sort of what their, I would say, quote unquote plans might be, militarily speaking, in the Arctic. But there is things happening domestically that will point towards sort of an interest in building polar capabilities in terms of, well, in this case, shipbuilding, seafaring in polar waters. There's also, again, going back to situational awareness, satellites, polar orbiting satellites, and yeah, I'll leave it that, and I might have another comment I will add later if we stay on this topic. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Shuxian. Anything on that one?
Sure. I think in terms of when talking about China's capabilities, when I think also we need to think about Russia is in a position that is capable of wants to be able to shut down its portion of Arctic region to Chinese scientific cruise, which is not unprecedented back in 2012 and even earlier. Even with all these growing number of icebreakers that China added to its Arctic crew, there's still the possibility that in the long run, even if not in the short run, that how far China can really send its icebreaker fleet into the Arctic is really much up to at least in the Russian Arctic is really up to Russia. And also with respect to the military capabilities, I think also build on what Mark said. I think there's an excellent study conducted by two Canadian scholars, Adam Lajunas and Timothy Troy, like a couple of years ago, talking about all these operational challenges posed to Chinese submarines will be facing when transiting into the Arctic, and also the feasibility of ever deploying the submarines into the Arctic as a way of showing China's power or deterring or adding additional deterrence to the United States. Because of the unique geographical features in the Arctic, it makes China's current SSBN or SSN extremely difficult to really maneuver to sneak into the Arctic without being detected by the U.S. Submarine sensing system deployed to the Bering Sea area. So I think all these remain questionable as to it's not just. I think like scholars like Emery Brady has been talking about, China definitely wants to have some strategic assets deployed to the Arctic to be a real global power. But on the other hand, I think we also need to look at how feasible that would be, at least for China's current military capabilities. It remains is still a question mark. And also there's an alternative. I think there have been discussion, especially after the war in Ukraine. Discussion among scholars like my former colleague at Naval War College, Andrew Erickson, talk about the possibility of Russia opening up its Arctic port access to Chinese military assets. But still, given the relationship between China and Russia, and also lingering Chinese suspicion as to how sustainable this no limit partnership would ever be, I think these are also things. I don't think in the short term that China would want to quickly jump into.
Great. Thank you very much. And I have a follow-up to that I'll ask all three of you based on your responses, is if there was an environmental disaster in the Arctic, a major oil spill along the Northern Sea Route or even in the Central Arctic Ocean, how do you think China would respond to that? So, Mark, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, one area where China is being put under a great deal of scrutiny. Certainly, there have been no shortage of criticisms of China's environmental record. And Beijing is very aware of that. It's cognizant of the fact that if it is seen as contributing to the problems of the environment in the Arctic, the repercussions will be significant. Therefore, I think that China is trying very much to be careful to present a green image. Like, again, going back about almost 10 years ago now, there was a potential partnership between Icelandic, Norwegian, and Chinese interests to set up oil surveys south of Iceland in the Drake region. And any kind of installations which would have been built, the project never went forward, were seen as having multiple safeguards, multiple layers to ensure that no kind of spill would take place. So I think China would very much try to stay on the same page as Arctic states to make sure that any kind of pollution or any kind of incident like that would be avoided.
Thanks, Mark. Trym?
I mean, I agree. I think China would, I think, again, looking at what the reaction would be from Arctic states, I think that's where you would see China react as well. I mean, on a counterpoint, I guess, right now would be you do see an increase, and we're talking, in the single digits of lower ice class or non-ice class vessels, oil tankers carrying Russian oil making its way to China through the Bering Strait. So you do see some of this behavior, which was again brought up at the Arctic Circle Assembly in Iceland last weekend or this weekend. Behavior that is again putting China under scrutiny, and in this case for environmental reasons. So yeah, that's just to add contrast to what Mark said.
Thanks, Trym. Shuxian?
That's a good question. I haven't really looked into that, but definitely if there's an accident, a spillover, or another accident like that calls for need for search and rescue and disasters relief, I think China. I like the approach that China adopted is definitely to at least verbally at least pay lip service definitely to go through to seek a multilateral collaborative approach, and also use this opportunity to call for expanded Arctic governance participation, pointing at the Arctic is a concern not just to Arctic states but also to non-Arctic states as well.
Great, thank you very much. And along those lines, we have another great question from the audience is, how is China using its soft power to influence the Arctic states besides investments in development and infrastructure? And what objectives are they trying to achieve with that soft power? So Shuxian, would you like to start with that one?
Well, my kind of question is, does China have any soft power among the Arctic states? I mean, with Canada, it's definitely, I think it's the story of China, how absent the deficiency of China's soft power with Canada, right? And also when China, one of China's entrepreneurs, Huang Lubo, tried to purchase a big chunk of land in Iceland for developing a golf course, something like that. It galvanized, strong local suspicions and oppositions that, kind of forced him to abort this plan. So I think, Arctic is not a good example where China has very skillfully employed any, soft power, so to speak.
Thank you for that, Trym. Thoughts on that one?
Exactly the same as Shuxian opened with. I don't really know how much soft power China has in the Arctic at the moment, again, in the US. And that is not only due to regional issues. I mean, this is, again, sort of looking at kind of the geopolitical relationship between China and the West, sort of in general. In the US and Canada, places like Sweden, China is, I would struggle to see what kind of soft power China has at the moment. I mean, and we can even see in the way science is being scrutinized at the moment, which is often touted as this kind of, we talk about science diplomacy and science being used as a in various ways as a soft power tool, that is also becoming less useful or effective. I think Mark might be able to comment on this after me, but I think in the past, and I'm not sure if you would even categorize this as soft power, but China has relied a lot on interpersonal networks, sort of with scholars and individuals who are influential in regional or national sort of politics, and both to sort of vet how they develop their foreign policy, which came out in 2018, and also sort of to remain, I think, kind of sort of up to date on things that are happening in the region. That is, I mean, I don't know if you would call it as soft power, again, because it's not sort of publicly oriented. It's private, but maybe Mark can touch on that.
Before I hand that over to Mark, I will ask the audience, if you have any final questions, please do type them in the chat while Mark is answering, and then we'll either answer those or go into some wrap up. Mark, so go ahead, please, on the soft power.
Yeah, good question, good discussions. I would have identified scientific diplomacy as the vanguard of China's soft power attempts in the Arctic. China stressing to the Arctic states that it has a particular set of expertise, that it's been trying to develop its scientific competency, especially in areas relevant to changes in the Arctic, so including climatology and glaciology. But the fact is, as was noted, there has been a lot of pushback because of China's poor relations with Canada, with Sweden, to a degree with Denmark. And while Beijing has certainly tried to create kind of a separation between the science and the politics, this is not always possible. And it certainly hasn't been possible in many cases. However, China is now, the other issue is, of course, as was noted, that a lot of person-to-person contacts have been either severed or downgraded because of the COVID situation, because of China's isolation. It has only been recently that we could start to see some serious scientific contact again with the lifting of visa restrictions. But it is a much different world. There's so much concern right now about dual use capabilities, the question of what China's science might be used for, and that little incident earlier this year of a weather balloon working its merry way across North America certainly did not help China's case at all. So I would say that in regards to soft power, I think, China has a lot of recouping to do, if it's even possible.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. So I'll ask all of you just to go around and if you have any closing thoughts or take-home messages that you would like our audience members to think about as they go forward when it comes to the Arctic. So Trem, I'll start with you.
Yeah, this is kind of a half-baked thought, but again, just based on the discussion we've had, and there are similar questions raised, in different kind of events and conversations I've taken part in regarding China and the Arctic. And I would also like maybe the other panelists to maybe comment on this after me if it's possible. But it seems to me that the conversation about, again, China's interests and, this kind of nebulous presence in the Arctic is kind of stuck in around like 2018, 2019, maybe, where like Mark mentioned in the opening with the Polar Silk Road and the policy paper that they released, a lot of stuff was happening. And you had Yamal LNG coming online, which had significant Chinese investment. And then you had all these plans, again, for Polar Silk Road and sort of these ideas about trans-Arctic shipping. And also just ideas and, sort of expanded research infrastructure in the Arctic as well. And a lot of this has, not materialized, and the situation has changed so that they're not, in the short term, at least not realistic. So I think the way we kind of talk about Chinese activities or presence or interest in the Arctic, sort of lagging the reality in a way. And I think but I guess it's up to us researchers to kind of update that picture a little bit. So that's sort of I will use that as kind of my final thoughts. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Shuxian, final thoughts. And we had one last question come in about China wanting to use this faster sea route that the Northern Sea Route offers. And do they need to create the superstructure, or I guess the infrastructure, in order to be able to effectively do that?
I think I'll frame my final remarks also in a way to respond to this question. I think, there, like Mark mentioned in his opening remark that, there have been a lot of big talks about, big projects, big investment, potential investment, China could or want to make in the Arctic, but still, much of those have yet come to materialize. So I think it's important for Arctic observers to, China observers to be able to tell, rhetorics and big talks from, the reality on the ground. And also, in terms of the superstructure that China needs in the Arctic, I think that's a typical example of, where China's big talks really doesn't match, the reality on the ground. That's what I want to say.
Thank you very much. And Mark, we'll give you the final word.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would say that, yes, this is definitely not 2018. And I think China now has to take a much more conservative approach to getting at what it wants out of the Arctic. The future of the Arctic Council is a little bit muddled. We're not sure how that is going to be serving Chinese interests, at least in the short term. That it is very likely China might have to rely more on bilateral diplomacy in order to further its Arctic interests. And because relations are a little bit shall we say, frigid with some Arctic Council members, that's going to be a lot more difficult. And I would say that China's also going to need to make use, for example, of Track 2 organizations, such as the Arctic Circle and various other regimes, in order to get a better idea of what's happening in the region, as well as to put forward its own aims. That said, I would not count China out of the Arctic. China has identified the polar regions as new strategic frontiers. It may not necessarily be a priority for Beijing, but it is still extremely important. Now, how this is going to affect the Polar Silk Road, yes, absolutely. The issue of whether the Polar Silk Road will become a major conduit for shipping. Well, first of all, we're talking about a very kind of slow motion situation. There are very few Chinese ships that can actually accomplish this successfully. They have the proper infrastructure to handle the route, even in the summer months. I think for the most part, China is looking at the Northern Sea Route as specific type of shipping for Russian oil and gas, for just-in-time shipping. There is a lot of infrastructure that simply isn't there if we're going to be talking about the Northern Sea Route becoming on the same par as, let's say, the Indian Ocean in regards to its shipping importance. So I think for the short term, we're going to be seeing a lot of retrenchment. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of rethinking in China about what it wants out of the Arctic. And I think there's also going to be a lot of discussion about how close China wants to get to Russia in regards to the Arctic itself, especially since Russia's long-term political situation is very cloudy. And that's a whole other paragraph right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I want to thank all of you for the great insights you've shared today. We really appreciate you joining us to have this conversation. I also want to thank Eleanor Albert, who's been behind the scenes as the global events facilitator that has coordinated all this, and certainly thank our audience members for joining us for this conversation. So if you want to rewatch this or hear anything else, there will be a recording of it made available. But thank you again. Have a good afternoon and evening wherever you are. And I hope you can join us for another Georgetown Global Event seminar in the future. Thank you all very much.